The flight was boarding smoothly until a flight attendant suddenly stopped in front of a young boy in first class. Her eyes narrowed. "Where's your guardian? This seat isn't for you." The boy tightened his grip on his stuffed airplane, his small hands trembling. Before he could explain, she grabbed his arm and shoved him back into his seat. Passengers glanced over but quickly looked away. No one said a word. No one helped him. She thought he was just another kid in the wrong place. She didn't know that the owner of the entire airline was listening, and by the time the flight landed, she wouldn't just lose her job, she'd lose everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The quiet hum of the airplane filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Among them was a small boy named Zaylin, his legs dangling slightly above the floor as he adjusted himself in the plush first-class chair. He clutched a worn-out, stuffed airplane in his hands, the soft fabric pressed tightly against his chest. His breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching as he tried to calm himself. Flying always made him nervous, not because he was afraid of the plane itself, but because of how uncomfortable it was for his body. His muscles often stiffened when he sat too long, and shifting positions took more effort than most people realized. Still, he was excited. It was his first time flying alone, and his father had promised everything would be fine. He just had to sit quietly, follow the rules, and enjoy the ride. Zaylin reached for his seatbelt, fumbling slightly as he tried to buckle it. His fingers weren't fast enough, and frustration built in his chest. His body ached from the stiffness, and he let out a small, frustrated whimper. The moment the sound left his mouth, a shadow loomed over him. A tall woman in a crisp uniform stood beside his seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her sharp eyes scanned him from head to toe, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ms. Calloway had been working as a flight attendant for years, and she prided herself on keeping order. To her, first class was meant for well-behaved, proper passengers, ones who knew how to act. And in her mind, this boy did not belong. "You need to sit still," Miss Calloway said, her voice clipped and impatient. She glanced at the stuffed airplane in his hands, her expression tightening with disapproval. "And put that away. First-class passengers don't carry toys around like that." Zaylin's fingers curled around the stuffed airplane protectively. He looked up at her, his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to say something, but his words didn't come fast enough. He had always struggled to speak when he was overwhelmed, and right now, under the weight of her sharp gaze, it felt impossible. His chest tightened, his breath quickening. Miss Calloway let out a sigh, rolling her eyes as she reached down. Without warning, she grabbed his arm and shoved him back against the seat, her grip firm. "I said sit still," she repeated, her tone cold. "You're making a scene." Zaylin gasped softly, his body tensing from the sudden force. A few passengers glanced over, their eyes flickering between the child and the flight attendant. Some looked uncomfortable but quickly turned back to their books or screens, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Others simply ignored it, too focused on their own comfort to care. Tears welled up in Zaylin's eyes, his breathing uneven as he shrank into his seat. He wanted to tell her that he was trying, that his legs hurt, that he wasn't making a scene on purpose, but the words were stuck, tangled in his throat like a knot he couldn't untie. His fingers trembled as he reached for his tablet, the screen lighting up as he tapped the voice message icon. His father had told him that if anything went wrong, he should send a message. So he did. His voice was soft, shaky. "Daddy, the lady hurt my arm. She said I can't be here. I want to go home." He pressed send, his hands trembling as he placed the tablet back down. His chest ached, not just from the fear, but from something deeper. The feeling of being unwanted, of being seen as a problem instead of a person. Ms. Calloway stood back up, smoothing down her uniform as if nothing had happened. To her, this was just another routine correction, another moment of keeping things in order. She didn't know that the voice message had already been delivered. She didn't know that, in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. Zaylin stared at the tablet screen, watching as the message status changed to delivered. His hands were still trembling, his arms sore from where Ms. Calloway had grabbed him. He blinked rapidly, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of all these strangers. But his chest felt tight, and no matter how hard he tried to steady his breathing, the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. Ms. Calloway, on the other hand, had already moved on. She walked down the aisle, fixing her uniform as if nothing had happened. To her, this was just another moment of keeping control in her section. A child crying was nothing more than an inconvenience. She had seen parents who let their kids roam free, disturbing the peace of first class. As far as she was concerned, Zalen was no different. If he couldn't behave, he shouldn't be here. At the front of the plane, another flight attendant, Mira, watched with hesitation. She had seen everything. She had seen the way Miss Calloway grabbed the boy, the way his small body tensed in fear. Mira had been a flight attendant for only a year, but she already knew how things worked. Speaking up against a senior attendant like Miss Calloway wouldn't be easy. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. She stepped closer to Miss Calloway near the beverage cart and lowered her voice. Was that really necessary? Miss Calloway barely glanced at her. Necessary, she scoffed. That boy was already causing a disturbance. He needs to learn how to sit still. Mira frowned. He's just a kid. And did you see his hands? I think he has trouble moving them properly. Miss Calloway let out an impatient sigh. Then he shouldn't be flying alone in first class. She grabbed a bottle of sparkling water from the cart and turned away. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if someone gave him that seat as a free upgrade. I'll check the system later. Mira opened her mouth to say something else, but she stopped herself. Pushing too hard would only make Miss Calloway more defensive. Instead, she glanced back toward Zalen. He was curled into his seat now, his stuffed airplane still gripped tightly in his hands, his head lowered. She didn't know what to do, but something about this felt wrong. Meanwhile, miles away, Elias Carter sat in his private office, finishing up a business call when his phone vibrated on the desk. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping when he saw it was from Zalen. He rarely called or sent messages while traveling, so Elias swiped to play the voice note immediately. The second he heard his son's shaky voice, his entire body stiffened. Daddy, the lady hurt my arm. She said I can't be here. I want to go home. Silence filled the office. Elias's jaw clenched as he played the message again, making sure he had heard it right. He could tell Zalen had been crying. He could hear the slight tremble in his voice, the way he struggled to get the words out. A sharp exhale left Elias's lips. He leaned forward, pressing a button on his office phone. Within seconds, his assistant, Cole, answered. Yes, sir? Elias's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. I need flight information for Zalen's trip. Right now. There was a slight pause before Cole responded. Checking now, sir. Elias tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind racing. Someone had hurt his son. Someone had shoved his son and made him feel like he didn't belong. And whoever it was, they had no idea whose child they had just mistreated. Elias sat perfectly still, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of his desk. His expression remained unreadable, but beneath his calm exterior, his patience was razor-thin. He wasn't the kind of man to lose his temper easily, but when it came to his son, there were no second chances. A soft chime from his phone interrupted his thoughts. A new email appeared on the screen. Flight 237, First Class Passenger Manifest. He opened it immediately, scanning through the list of names. His eyes locked onto one in particular. Senior Flight Attendant, Calloway, Marion. He memorized the name in seconds before reaching for his phone again. Cole, he said, his voice steady but firm. Get me in touch with the captain of that flight. Yes, sir, Cole responded swiftly. I'll have them on the line in 5 minutes. Elias ended the call and exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the phone. This wasn't just about a flight attendant being rude. His son had been physically handled, shoved by someone who was supposed to ensure his safety. And to make it worse, Zalen had been made to feel like he didn't belong in a place where he had every right to be. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He could already predict what was going to happen next. The flight attendant would probably try to downplay the situation. She would say it was a misunderstanding, that Zalen was just restless, maybe even disruptive. Elias had seen it happen before. People assumed things about his son the moment they saw him. They assumed he was difficult because he moved differently. They assumed he wasn't supposed to be in first class because they didn't expect a disabled child to belong there. But this time, those assumptions were going to cost someone their career. Meanwhile, on Flight 237, Ms. Calloway moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers as if nothing had happened. Her lips curled into a satisfied smirk when she noticed that Zaylin had finally quieted down. She had dealt with countless passengers in her career, entitled ones, demanding ones, those who thought they were more important than they really were. She had no patience for them, and while she wasn't sure how a boy like Zaylin had ended up in first class, she had no intention of catering to him. From the galley, Mira stole another glance toward the boy. He hadn't moved much since sending his message. His tiny hands were still curled around his stuffed airplane, his body tense. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped closer to him and crouched down. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Zaylin hesitated before looking up. His eyes were red, his breathing still uneven. He didn't say anything, but he gave a tiny shake of his head. Mira swallowed. Did Ms. Calloway hurt your arm?" Zaylin glanced down at his arm, the place where Ms. Calloway had grabbed him. He nodded slowly. Mira felt a lump form in her throat. She already knew the answer, but hearing it directly from him made her stomach twist. "Do you need anything?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. Zaylin hesitated again. Then after a long pause, he whispered, "I want my dad." Mira nodded, her chest tightening. "Okay," she said. "I'll be right back." She stood up and walked toward the front of the plane, her mind racing. She couldn't stay silent about this, and she didn't know it yet, but the decision she was about to make would change everything. Mira's heart pounded as she made her way to the galley. She had never questioned a senior flight attendant before, but this was different. This wasn't about a passenger complaining about the wrong meal or an uncomfortable seat. This was about a child, a disabled child, being mistreated by someone who was supposed to protect him. She found Ms. Calloway by the beverage cart, pouring a cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. Mira hesitated for half a second before stepping forward. "Ms. Calloway, can I speak with you for a moment?" Ms. Calloway barely spared her a glance. "If this is about the service rotations, we'll go over it after." "It's about the boy," Mira interrupted, keeping her voice steady. The older woman finally looked up, her brows knitting together in irritation. "What about him?" Mira took a quiet breath, knowing there was no easy way to say it. "He's upset. He says you hurt his arm." Ms. Calloway scoffed. "Oh, please, I barely touched him." She set her cup down and crossed her arms. "He was fidgeting, and I did what any professional would do. I corrected his behavior." Mira's jaw tightened. "You grabbed him, Ms. Calloway, and now he's sitting there, holding his stuffed airplane like he's scared to move." "He should sit still," Ms. Calloway snapped. "Do you know how many high-paying customers we have in first class? No one wants to listen to a whining child for an entire flight. If he can't handle it, he shouldn't be here." Mira's stomach turned. "He can't help it," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Did you even look at him? His hands shake when he tries to do things. He struggles to get comfortable, and you shoved him back in his seat like he was some kind of nuisance." Ms. Calloway's eyes darkened. "Watch your tone, Mira," she warned, but Mira didn't back down. "What if someone did that to your child?" she asked. "Would you be so dismissive then?" For the first time, Ms. Calloway hesitated. The brief flicker of something, guilt, maybe, passed over her face, but it disappeared just as quickly. She straightened her uniform and took a sip of her coffee. "It's done. The boy's quiet now, isn't he?" Mira stared at her, stunned. She had been hoping, even expecting, that Ms. Calloway would at least pretend to care. But there was nothing. No remorse, no second thoughts, just cold indifference. Mira clenched her fists. She had tried reasoning with her. Now she needed to do something else. Before she could move, the intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Ms. Calloway frowned, clearly thrown off. She glanced at Mira before exhaling sharply. "Stay out of this," she muttered before brushing past her toward the cockpit. Mira didn't move right away. She stared at the back of Ms. Calloway's uniform as she walked away, her mind racing. Something was happening, and whatever it was, Ms. Calloway had no idea how bad it was about to get. Miss Calloway walked briskly toward the cockpit, adjusting her uniform as she went. She had no idea why she was being called, but the sharp tone in the captain's voice made her uneasy. She prided herself on maintaining control in every situation, but something about this felt different. The moment she stepped inside, she saw Captain Hughes standing near the control panel, his expression unreadable. Next to him, the co-pilot monitored the flight's progress, barely sparing her a glance. But what made her stomach tighten was the voice coming through the in-flight phone on the panel. It was deep, controlled, and unmistakably powerful. "Is she there?" the voice asked. Captain Hughes nodded once, though the person on the other end couldn't see. "Yes, sir. Senior Attendant Calloway is here." Ms. Calloway swallowed. "Who is this?" The captain's eyes narrowed. "This is Elias Carter." Her breath hitched. Elias Carter? The name sent a chill down her spine. She had never met him in person, but she knew exactly who he was. The Elias Carter. Founder and owner of Aerosky Airlines, the very airline she worked for. The man who had built the company from the ground up and held absolute authority over everyone, from executives down to flight attendants like her. And more importantly, he was Zaylen's father. For the first time, she felt something shift in her chest. "I'd like an explanation," Elias said, his voice steady but sharp. "Right now." Miss Calloway opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had no idea what had already been reported or how much he knew. Captain Hughes crossed his arms. "We received a direct complaint from Mr. Carter regarding his son." He shot her a look of pure disappointment. "Would you like to explain why a first-class passenger, a child, was physically handled by a member of my crew?" Ms. Calloway stiffened. Captain, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The boy was being disruptive, and I simply corrected his behavior. I never meant to." "You shoved him," Elias interrupted. "My son, a disabled child." Ms. Calloway's mouth went dry. "I heard his voice," Elias continued, his tone lower now, deadlier. "He told me what you did. You think I'm going to let this slide?" She forced a small, tight smile. "Sir, I assure you, it was nothing serious. He was fidgeting a lot and You only decided he didn't belong," Elias said coldly. "You only humiliated him in front of other passengers. You only grabbed his arm and forced him back into his seat like he was a problem instead of a person." Captain Hughes cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you that this will be handled accordingly." He cut his eyes toward Ms. Calloway. "She will be removed from duty the moment we land." Ms. Calloway's head snapped toward the captain. "Wait, removed?" Hughes's expression darkened. "You thought you could put your hands on a child and just keep working like nothing happened?" He shook his head. "That's not how this works." Elias spoke again, his voice like ice. "This conversation is far from over, Ms. Calloway. You will return to my son immediately, and you will personally apologize to him. And when this flight lands, you will be escorted for questioning by the airline board." Ms. Calloway's heart pounded. This was escalating too fast. "Sir, please, But the line clicked off. The captain's glare remained firm. "Get out there. Now!" Ms. Calloway turned, her legs feeling heavy as she stepped out of the cockpit. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her. But it was no longer just about Zaylen, because now she wasn't just answering to a child. She was answering to the man who owned the sky she was flying in. Ms. Calloway stepped out of the cockpit, her palms clammy despite the cold air circulating through the cabin. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control. Her stomach twisted as she made her way back down the aisle, every step feeling heavier than the last. Passengers barely looked at her, too engrossed in their movies, meals, or conversations. None of them knew that her entire career was crumbling before the plane had even touched the ground. As she approached the first-class section, her gaze landed on Zaylen. He was still curled up in his seat, his stuffed airplane clutched tightly against his chest. His eyes were red, his small fingers twitching slightly as he held on to the armrest. He hadn't moved much since she last saw him, but something about his expression sent an unfamiliar feeling through her. For the first time, she felt guilt. She had convinced herself that she was just doing her job, that keeping order in first class was more important than some restless child. But looking at him now, how small and quiet he had become. She felt something sink deep in her chest. Mira stood a few rows away, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick as Ms. Calloway stopped beside Zaylen's seat. Mira crossed her arms, waiting to see what she would do. Ms. Calloway cleared her throat. "Zaylen." The boy flinched slightly at the sound of her voice, but didn't look up. She swallowed hard. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said stiffly. "I'd like to escort you back to your seat properly." Zaylen finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Ms. Calloway hesitated. She wasn't used to this. Being questioned, being held accountable. She was always the one who made the rules, who controlled the situation. But now, for the first time, the power wasn't in her hands. "I apologize," she added quickly, forcing the words out. Zaylen blinked at her. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but then he tilted his head. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" His voice was small but steady. Ms. Calloway nodded stiffly. "Yes, there was—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "An error in judgment." Zaylen frowned slightly. "You saw my ticket," he said quietly, "and you still told me to move." A few passengers nearby shifted in their seats. They had been silent before, but now their eyes flickered toward the conversation. Ms. Calloway's skin prickled. "I may have misjudged the situation." Zaylen didn't look satisfied. He studied her, his small fingers tightening around his stuffed airplane. Then, without looking away, he reached for his tablet and tapped the screen. A few seconds later, a new voice message was sent. "Daddy, she's asking me to go back now. What should I do?" The message was delivered instantly. Miss Calloway's stomach dropped. The decision wasn't up to her anymore. It was up to the man who could decide whether she ever worked in the skies again. Zaylen placed the tablet back on his lap, his small fingers gripping the edges as he waited for a response. The quiet ding of the message being sent echoed in Ms. Calloway's ears like a warning bell. She felt an uneasy tightness in her chest, the weight of what was happening pressing down on her more than before. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, their curiosity growing. They had seen the way Ms. Calloway had spoken to Zaylen earlier. They had watched as she dismissed him, treated him like he didn't belong. And now they were watching her stand there, stiff and uneasy, as she realized she wasn't in control anymore. The silence stretched as Zaylen stared at his tablet, waiting. Then the screen lit up. New voice message from Daddy. Zaylen tapped it immediately, and the deep, firm voice of Elias Carter filled the quiet space. "Take your time. Make her understand what she did." Ms. Calloway felt the blood drain from her face. Zaylen slowly looked up at her, his eyes steady. He wasn't crying anymore. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't shrinking away like before. He had power now. Ms. Calloway forced a polite, tight-lipped smile. "Come on, let's get you back to your seat," she said, trying to move past the awkwardness. "We don't want to—" "Why did you think I didn't belong here?" Zaylen interrupted, his voice soft but clear. Ms. Calloway froze. Passengers turned their heads now, fully engaged in what was happening. Even Mira, who had been watching quietly from a distance, held her breath. Zaylen sat up straighter in his seat, his stuffed airplane still clutched in one hand. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he continued. "Just me. Why?" Miss Calloway's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The silence felt suffocating. Mira shifted slightly, watching Ms. Calloway's expression. For years, the senior flight attendant had carried herself with unshakable confidence. But now, in front of a small boy in a cabin full of passengers, she looked trapped. Zaylen tilted his head, waiting. "If you're going to say sorry," he said quietly, "you should at least tell the truth." Miss Calloway's throat tightened. She wanted to brush past this. She wanted to pretend it wasn't a big deal. But Zaylen wasn't letting her. And now, with passengers listening, with eyes locked on her, she was forced to do something she had never done before. She had to answer. The weight of Zaylen's words pressed down on Miss Calloway, heavier than anything she had felt before. The boy wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice or demanding anything. He had simply asked a question she didn't want to answer. Her mouth felt dry as she struggled to come up with something to say. The usual responses, the excuses she had used before, wouldn't work here. Not now. Not with passengers listening. Not with the owner of the airline on the other end of that tablet, waiting to hear how this would play out. Miss Calloway cleared her throat. She started, but the words died before they could even take shape. Zaylen's eyes didn't leave her. He was small, quiet, and vulnerable just minutes ago. But now he had completely changed. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't looking away, hoping to be ignored. He was waiting for the truth. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The first-class cabin, once filled with casual conversations and the clinking of silverware, had gone still. Passengers who had chosen to stay silent earlier were no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. They were listening, really listening. Mira crossed her arms, watching Ms. Calloway carefully. She had never seen her hesitate like this before. Ms. Calloway had always carried herself with a strict sense of authority, but now she looked cornered. Zaylen's fingers curled around the stuffed airplane in his lap. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he repeated. "Just me." Ms. Calloway exhaled sharply through her nose, her jaw tightening. I didn't mean to offend you," she said, her tone stiff. I thought there was a mistake." Zaylen blinked slowly. "Why?" Miss Calloway shifted uncomfortably. "Because—" She stopped, realizing that anything she said now would either make her look foolish or worse, expose the truth she wasn't ready to face. Because he was a child? Because he was disabled? Because she assumed he had been put in first class by accident? She had never questioned the well-dressed businessman in the first row. She had never asked the older woman sipping champagne for her ticket. She had walked past them all without a second glance. But Zaylen, the moment she saw him, his small frame, his nervous shifting, his quiet whimpers, she had made a decision. And now, that decision was coming back to destroy her. Zaylen's voice broke through her thoughts again. "You looked at me and thought I didn't belong." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and it was true. Miss Calloway opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The silence was deafening. Mira's eyes flickered between them, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for Miss Calloway. This wasn't just about an apology anymore. This was about accountability. Zaylen slowly sat up straighter. "If you're sorry," he said softly, "then say what you did." Miss Calloway swallowed hard, her hands clenching at her sides. She hesitated again, but there was nowhere left to hide. The longer she stood there in silence, the worse it became. Passengers were waiting, Mira was waiting, and Elias Carter, the man who could end her entire career with a single phone call, was definitely waiting. Finally, Miss Calloway exhaled shakily and forced herself to speak. "I misjudged you," she admitted, her voice lower now. "I looked at you and I assumed you weren't supposed to be here." Mira's brows lifted slightly in surprise. She hadn't expected actual honesty. Zaylen studied Ms. Calloway carefully. His fingers still gripped his stuffed airplane, but his shoulders weren't as tense anymore. "So," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you thought I wasn't supposed to be here, but I was." Ms. Calloway nodded stiffly, swallowing her pride. "Yes." Zaylen tilted his head slightly. "Then why did you push me?" Ms. Calloway's throat tightened. The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Passengers leaned in slightly, waiting. No one spoke. No one moved. Ms. Calloway's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to say that she hadn't really pushed him, that it wasn't that bad, that he was exaggerating. But she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. She had shoved him. She had grabbed his arm and forced him back into his seat. She had seen him struggling and treated him like an inconvenience. And now she was being forced to admit it. Mira watched closely, silently wondering what Ms. Calloway would do next. Ms. Calloway inhaled sharply, her voice strained. I shouldn't have done that," she finally said. "I was impatient, and I was wrong." Zaylen's expression remained unreadable. He studied her for another long moment before giving a small nod. "Okay." Ms. Calloway's brows furrowed slightly. "Okay?" Zaylen adjusted the stuffed airplane in his hands. "Okay," he repeated. "Now you know." Ms. Calloway blinked. She had expected anger, or maybe even more questioning. But instead, Zaylen had accepted her words, not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of what she had done. Passengers exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly, as if silently agreeing that the boy had won this conversation without ever needing to raise his voice. Ms. Calloway felt strange. For years, she had been the one controlling passengers, but now a small boy, a child she had dismissed without a second thought, had just forced her to confront something she had never questioned before. And somehow, that was worse than any punishment she could have imagined. Mira finally stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I think that's enough," she said, her tone neutral but firm. "Let's get Zaylen back to his seat." Zaylen hesitated, then nodded and slowly stood up. His movements were careful, deliberate. He still didn't trust his legs completely after what had happened earlier. Mira gently placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. Miss Calloway stepped aside, but as they passed, Zaylen paused. He looked up at her one last time. "Next time," he said softly, "don't just see what you expect to see." And with that, he walked past her, leaving Ms. Calloway standing there, feeling smaller than she ever had before. Ms. Calloway stood frozen in the aisle as Zaylen walked past her, guided gently by Mira. The weight of his words settled deep in her chest, heavier than she expected. "Next time, don't just see what you expect to see." The sentence replayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. It was such a simple thing for him to say, yet it carried more weight than anything she had heard in years. She had built her career on experience, on knowing how to read people, on understanding who belonged where. And yet today, a child, a disabled boy who should have been easy to dismiss, had shattered that illusion with nothing more than quiet strength and a refusal to accept anything less than the truth. Passengers whispered among themselves as Zaylen returned to his seat. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others gave him quiet nods of respect. Miss Calloway could feel their eyes on her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Shame. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her judgment was always correct. But standing here now, surrounded by people who had just witnessed her being questioned and failing to defend herself, she felt completely exposed. Mira helped Zaylen settle back into his first-class seat, adjusting his blanket and making sure he was comfortable. She spoke to him softly, offering him juice and a snack, treating him the way Ms. Calloway should have from the beginning. Zaylen accepted the juice but didn't drink it right away. Instead, he picked up his tablet again. His fingers moved over the screen, carefully typing a short message. Delivered. "Daddy, I'm back in my seat now." Ms. Calloway swallowed hard. She had no idea what Elias Carter was going to do next. But she already knew one thing. Her future at this airline was hanging by a thread. She turned, hoping to retreat to the galley, to disappear before anyone could say anything else. But just as she took a step back, the intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hughes speaking. We have received an urgent directive from airline headquarters. We kindly ask all crew members to remain at their assigned stations as we prepare for landing." "Thank you," Ms. Calloway's breath hitched. Passengers exchanged confused glances. That was not a standard announcement. Mira turned her head slightly toward the galley. "That's weird." Ms. Calloway's stomach twisted. She knew what that announcement meant. This wasn't just about her apologizing to Zaylen anymore. This had reached airline executives. As if to confirm her fears, the in-flight phone near the front of the cabin buzzed sharply. Mira and Ms. Calloway both turned to look at it. Another flight attendant, Jonas, picked it up. "This is flight crew," he said cautiously. He was quiet for a moment as he listened. Then his eyes flickered toward Ms. Calloway, his expression shifting to something she couldn't quite read. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Yes, sir. Understood." Ms. Calloway's fingers clenched at her sides. "What was that about?" Jonas hesitated, then set the phone back down before turning to face her directly. "You're to report to the airport security team the moment we land." A heavy silence fell between them. Ms. Calloway's throat tightened. "Security?" she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. Jonas didn't look at her with sympathy. He simply nodded. "You're being escorted off the plane." Ms. Calloway's breath came faster now. Her mind raced with 100 thoughts, each one worse than the last. Escorted off the plane? By security? Passengers were still whispering. Though some had gone quiet, sensing that something serious was happening. Mira exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I told you," she muttered under her breath, though not unkindly. Ms. Calloway's hands felt ice cold. This wasn't just a disciplinary meeting. This wasn't just a warning. This was serious. She turned her gaze toward Xylan. He was leaning back in his seat now, staring out the window. His fingers traced absent patterns on his stuffed airplane, his face unreadable. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't smiled or celebrated. He had simply told the truth. And now that truth had caught up to her. She inhaled sharply, turning back toward the galley. If she had any hope of keeping her career intact, she needed to think fast. But no matter how she tried to spin it, she knew one thing for certain. She had already lost. Ms. Calloway stood frozen, her breath shallow as the reality of what was happening settled in. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, a murmur of curiosity and judgment spreading like wildfire among the passengers. She had spent years maintaining authority on flights, ensuring that she was the one in control. But now that power had slipped away completely. Passengers who had once ignored the incident were now paying full attention. Some stole glances at her, others openly stared, piecing together what had just unfolded. A few were already typing on their phones, likely messaging family or colleagues about the drama unfolding mid-flight. This wasn't just a small mistake. This was turning into a scandal. Mira watched Miss Calloway carefully, studying the way her shoulders tensed and her hands twitched slightly at her sides. She had seen the senior flight attendant handle difficult situations before, but this was different. Miss Calloway wasn't the one in charge anymore, and she knew it. Miss Calloway forced herself to stand taller, smoothing her uniform with stiff hands. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Mira raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Miss Calloway shot her a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention toward Jonas, her voice clipped. "Who exactly gave that order?" Jonas didn't flinch under her glare. "Directly from headquarters," he said evenly. "Elias Carter himself." The name hit like a physical blow, sending a sharp, cold realization down Ms. Calloway's spine. Elias Carter, the man who owned the airline, the man whose child she had just shoved. Her mouth felt dry. "This is all being blown out of proportion," she tried again, lowering her voice. "I was simply doing my job." Mira let out a soft breath of disbelief. "Your job? You shoved a child, Calloway. You physically handled a disabled child and treated him like an inconvenience." Ms. Calloway stiffened, her jaw locking. "I was keeping order in first class." Mira's expression darkened. "No," she said firmly. "You were making an assumption. And now, you're paying for it." Ms. Calloway's breath hitched, but she quickly forced her features into an impassive mask. She had dealt with difficult passengers, entitled executives, and high-pressure situations before. She could fix this. She just needed to stay calm. She turned toward the cockpit, her mind already racing through possible defenses. Maybe if she spoke to the captain, she could convince him to de-escalate things. Maybe she could claim Xylan had been exaggerating. Maybe. The soft chime of the in-flight phone interrupted her thoughts. Jonas answered it, and this time his eyes widened slightly. When he spoke, his voice was noticeably more tense. "Yes, sir. I'll inform her immediately." He hung up and looked directly at Ms. Calloway. "You're to remain seated for the rest of the flight," he instructed. "You are not to interact with any passengers, including Xylan." Ms. Calloway's lips parted slightly. "Excuse me?" Jonas exhaled, lowering his voice. "Headquarters has made their decision. You're not just being escorted off the plane, Calloway. You're being suspended." The words hit like a slap to the face. Mira's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Pity? Disbelief? Even she hadn't expected the punishment to come this swiftly. Ms. Calloway's stomach twisted. "They can't just—" Jonas cut her off. "It's done." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "You'll receive an official letter once we land, but you're finished on this flight." Ms. Calloway's fingers twitched at her sides. "And what am I supposed to do until we land?" she asked through clenched teeth. Jonas gestured toward an empty crew seat in the galley. "Sit." Ms. Calloway's skin prickled with humiliation. A senior flight attendant, ordered to sit like a passenger in trouble. Passengers were still murmuring, stealing glances at her. She knew that by the time the plane landed, the entire crew would be whispering about this. Maybe even other airlines. This wasn't just a suspension. This was public humiliation. Miss Calloway clenched her jaw and turned stiffly, making her way toward the galley. She sat down, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She had always been the one giving orders. Now she was the one being put in her place. Meanwhile, Zaylen sat quietly in his seat, sipping his juice, his small fingers still curled around his stuffed airplane. His tablet vibrated again with a new message. "Daddy, sit tight. I'll be at the gate when you land." Zaylen didn't respond, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Miss Calloway thought the punishment was over. She had no idea that this was only the beginning. The airplane continued its steady flight, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Passengers, once focused on their meals and entertainment, now exchanged subtle glances, murmuring in hushed tones. The tension that had filled first class earlier had settled into something heavier, a quiet anticipation of what would happen next. Ms. Calloway sat stiffly in the crew seat in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of her uniform skirt so tightly that her fingers ached. She had never felt so powerless in her entire career. Just an hour ago, she had walked through this cabin with authority, ensuring passengers followed her rules. Now she was nothing more than a passenger waiting for judgment. The soft chime of the intercom cut through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." Ms. Calloway's stomach churned. This is it. Across the aisle, Mira moved methodically through her duties, checking passenger seatbelts and ensuring everything was in order. But when she reached Zaylen's seat, she paused. He was still gripping his stuffed airplane, but his body no longer held the same tension as before. He looked calm, almost as if he already knew what was going to happen next. Mira crouched down slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You okay?" Zaylen nodded. His fingers tapped gently against the tablet in his lap. "My dad's going to be there when we land," he said softly. Mira hesitated. She wasn't sure what to say to that. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, with certainty, like he knew something no one else did. She gave him a small nod. "Good," she said. "You deserve that." As she moved away, she stole a glance toward Miss Calloway. The woman's expression was unreadable, but Mira could see the way her shoulders were rigid, how her jaw was locked tight. Miss Calloway was trying to appear composed, but Mira knew better. She was terrified. The plane dipped lower as they neared the airport, the city lights flickering below like a sea of tiny lanterns. The engines roared softly as the landing gear deployed, and Mira moved back to her seat, strapping in as the final approach began. The moment the plane touched down, everything changed. Passengers immediately reached for their phones, the familiar chimes of messages being received filling the air. Some stretched, others shifted impatiently, eager to disembark. But Miss Calloway barely moved, because at the front of the plane, just beyond the jet bridge window, 2 security officers were already waiting. Her heart plummeted. Mira followed her gaze, her own eyes widening slightly. They hadn't wasted any time. Jonas approached from the galley, clearing his throat. "Ms. Calloway," he said quietly, "you're to remain seated until the passengers have exited. Then you'll be escorted off the aircraft." Ms. Calloway turned sharply, her voice lower but laced with frustration. "Escorted where?" Jonas didn't blink. "To the executive office. Elias Carter wants a formal meeting." Passengers were already rising from their seats, stretching and gathering their belongings. The first-class section was among the first to leave, and as Zaylen unbuckled his seatbelt, he reached for his stuffed airplane and tablet before carefully climbing down. Ms. Calloway watched him. He didn't rush. He didn't look nervous. He simply walked to the front of the plane, where his father was already waiting. The moment Zaylen stepped off the aircraft, Elias Carter was there, dressed in a tailored black suit, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a man who rarely needed to raise his voice. His presence alone demanded respect. Passengers who walked past stole glances, some recognizing him immediately. Zaylen looked up at his father and smiled. "Hi, Daddy." Elias exhaled, his features softening just enough as he knelt down to his son's level. He placed a warm hand on Zalen's shoulder, checking him over with quiet precision. "Are you okay?" Zalen nodded. "I am now." Elias's expression darkened slightly as he glanced toward the jet bridge, toward the woman who still hadn't stepped off the plane. Miss Calloway could feel his gaze from inside the cabin. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she forced herself to sit still. This wasn't just about losing her job anymore. This was about facing the most powerful man in the airline industry and answering for what she had done. The cabin emptied row by row, passengers rolling their carry-ons down the aisle, stretching stiff limbs as they exited the plane. But no one moved slower than Miss Calloway. She stayed seated in the crew chair, back stiff, hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could hear the footsteps, the murmurs, the occasional glance from those who had witnessed everything. They weren't curious anymore. They knew what was happening. She was being left behind. Mira unbuckled her own seatbelt and stood up, shaking her head slightly as she stole one last look at Miss Calloway. This was a moment Mira never thought she'd see. The once untouchable senior flight attendant, always so firm, always so confident, was now just another employee waiting for judgment. Jonas, ever professional, finally stepped forward. "It's time." Miss Calloway inhaled sharply through her nose. She rose from the seat, smoothing down her uniform even though she knew it wouldn't make a difference now. With every step toward the exit, the tightness in her chest grew worse. She wasn't walking off the plane as part of the crew. She was walking off like a criminal being processed. The moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, her heart stopped. Standing right there, just past the open aircraft door, was Elias Carter. The two uniformed security officers flanked him, but he didn't need them. His presence alone was enough to command the space. Passengers who had already exited stood near the terminal windows, openly watching now. Some pretended to check their phones, but everyone was listening. The news had traveled quickly through the airport. Something big was happening on Flight 237. Elias didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her. Ms. Calloway couldn't hold his gaze for more than a second. Her throat felt dry, her hands twitching slightly at her sides. She wanted to speak first, to explain, to control the conversation before it spiraled completely out of her hands. But the second she parted her lips, Elias tilted his head slightly, and the sheer weight of his gaze silenced her. "Follow me," he said, voice low and unreadable. Ms. Calloway obeyed without question. She didn't dare look back at the terminal crowd. She knew what she'd see. Passengers whispering, employees staring, the rumor already spreading faster than she could contain it. She followed Elias through a set of private doors, away from the public eye. The walls of the executive corridor were sleek, lined with dark wood and soft overhead lighting. She had never walked through these halls before. She had never been called to an executive meeting like this. And she already knew that wasn't a good thing. Inside the executive office, the door closed behind her with a soft click. The conference room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The table was long, polished, surrounded by leather chairs that looked far more expensive than anything Ms. Calloway had ever sat in. Elias Carter took the seat at the head of the table, crossing one leg over the other as he adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. His movements were deliberate, controlled. Ms. Calloway sat stiffly across from him, hands folded neatly in her lap, heart pounding. The door opened again. A woman in a tailored navy blue suit entered, her dark-rimmed glasses perched perfectly on her nose. She carried a tablet, her gaze cool and analytical. Leona Carter, Elias's wife. Ms. Calloway's stomach tightened painfully. She had met Leona only once, at a corporate event years ago. But even back then, she had known that the woman was not to be taken lightly. She was sharp, calculated, and had just as much power in the company as her husband did. Leona took a seat beside Elias, placing her tablet down on the table without a word. Then, the door opened one last time, and Zalen stepped in. Ms. Calloway felt her entire body tense. He was still holding his stuffed airplane, but he didn't look small anymore. He looked steady, standing between his parents, his head held high. Leona was the first to break the silence. "You know why we're here?" Ms. Calloway forced a tight nod. Elias leaned forward slightly. "Do you?" Ms. Calloway swallowed hard. "I understand that I've been called here due to an issue with a passenger." Leona raised an eyebrow. "An issue?" Elias's voice was flat, emotionless. "You put your hands on my child." Ms. Calloway's breath caught in her throat. Leona adjusted her glasses. "Let's be very clear about what happened," she said, her voice calm but dangerously sharp. "You didn't just remove a passenger from first class. You singled out a disabled child. You assumed he didn't belong. And then, when he struggled to sit still, you chose to handle it by grabbing him." Ms. Calloway's fingers dug into her lap. I, I didn't mean—" Elias cut her off with a single look. "I don't care what you meant," he said, his voice cold. "I care about what you did." The room fell silent. For the first time, Ms. Calloway realized that she wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to listen, and she was not in control. Zaylen stepped forward slightly, tilting his head. His voice was soft, but firm. "Would you have pushed me if I looked different?" Ms. Calloway's throat tightened. She didn't answer, because deep down she knew the truth. And now so did everyone else. Ms. Calloway's throat was tight, her hands clenched together so firmly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. The silence in the executive office was heavier than anything she had ever experienced. This was no longer about airline policies or customer service procedures. This was about the truth. And the truth was staring her directly in the face. Zaylen stood there, small but steady, waiting for an answer. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't crying. He was simply watching her. And that was far worse. Leona folded her hands neatly on the table. "Well," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "Answer him." Ms. Calloway's lips parted, but no words came out, because there was no good answer. No matter what she said, the reality was clear. She had judged Zaylen the second she saw him. She had assumed. She had reacted. She had put her hands on a child who didn't deserve it. And now she was being forced to sit in that truth. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound measured and deliberate. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You worked for this airline for how many years?" Ms. Calloway swallowed. 12, she murmured. Elias nodded. 12 years, he repeated. 12 years of experience. And yet somehow, you still thought it was appropriate to shove a child in his seat. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Ms. Calloway's heart pounded. I didn't mean—" Elias lifted a hand, silencing her instantly. "You thought he didn't belong in first class," he said simply. "Just say it." Ms. Calloway's stomach dropped. Passengers had whispered it. Mira had implied it. Jonas had known it. But now the owner of the airline himself had said it out loud. She could feel the walls closing in on her. Elias tilted his head slightly. "You're not going to admit it?" Ms. Calloway's breath was shaky. I made a mistake." Leona adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "A mistake is dropping a passenger's drink," she said coolly. "A mistake is misplacing a meal order." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze like a blade cutting through the air. "You put your hands on our son." Ms. Calloway's body went rigid. Zaylen's fingers tightened slightly around his stuffed airplane, but his voice remained steady. "You thought I didn't belong here," he repeated, softer this time. "Because I don't look like the other passengers." Ms. Calloway's stomach twisted painfully. It would have been easier if he had yelled at her, if he had screamed or thrown a tantrum. But he wasn't doing any of that. He was calm, and somehow that made it so much worse. Elias sighed, shaking his head slightly. "I've dealt with people like you before, Ms. Calloway," he said. "People who think that because they wear a uniform, because they've been given a small amount of authority, they get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." He let the words settle before continuing. "You don't get to decide that. You never did." Ms. Calloway's chest felt tight. She could feel herself breaking down inside, piece by piece, but she refused to let it show. Leona glanced at Elias before tapping a few things on her tablet. "Your employment contract," she said, sliding the screen across the table so it faced Ms. Calloway. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from Aerosky Airlines." The words hit like a punch. Miss Calloway's breath caught in her throat. "What? Terminated?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly cleared it. I understand a suspension, but I've worked here for 12 years. Elias's expression remained unchanged. "And in those 12 years, did you ever stop to consider how many other passengers you judged unfairly?" Miss Calloway froze, because she knew the answer. She had done this before. Maybe not exactly like this, not with a child, not in a situation this severe, but she had spent years making assumptions about passengers. Years deciding within seconds who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. And now, it had finally caught up to her. Leona's voice remained cold. Your final paycheck will be processed within the week. You will also receive a letter barring you from employment within any subsidiary airline under the Aerosky brand. Ms. Calloway's stomach churned violently. This wasn't just losing a job. This was career ending. She knew how the airline industry worked. News of this would spread. Other companies would hear about it. Her name would be whispered in HR offices, her record tarnished permanently. She had spent years climbing up the ranks, gaining authority, earning respect. And in the span of one flight, she had lost everything. Her fingers curled tightly into her lap, her face pale. Mr. Carter, please, she tried, her voice quieter now. I understand I made a mistake, but is there really no way to… Elias's eyes hardened. Would you have given my son a second chance if the roles were reversed? Ms. Calloway stopped. Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. Would you have let him stay in first class? Would you have apologized if no one had forced you to? Ms. Calloway couldn't answer, because the answer was no. She wouldn't have given Zaylin a second thought. She would have gone on with her day, convinced she had done the right thing. She never would have apologized. And now, she was paying the price for it. Leona glanced at Zaylin, then back at her husband. There's nothing more to discuss. Elias nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. The decision was final. Security officers stepped forward, waiting. Miss Calloway's breath shook. She was actually being escorted out. She wanted to fight back, to protest, to demand just one more chance. But she already knew. There wasn't one. With stiff, mechanical movements, she stood. She didn't look at Elias. She didn't look at Leona. And she definitely didn't look at Zaylin. She walked toward the door, her legs heavy, her chest tight, her career shattered. And as she stepped outside, she heard one last thing. Zaylin's quiet voice. Not cruel, not triumphant, just honest. Now you know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. The door clicked shut. Miss Calloway stepped out of the conference room, her breathing shallow, her head spinning. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the weight of everything collapsed onto her shoulders all at once. She wasn't sure where to go. She wasn't sure what to do. The security officers stood on either side of her, waiting for her to start walking. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic removal, no raised voices. But the quiet way they stood beside her made it clear. She was no longer welcome here. Her shoes clicked softly against the sleek marble floors as she moved forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. 12 years. 12 years of service. Gone. She had told herself from the moment she entered that meeting that she wouldn't cry, that she wouldn't break, that she would keep her pride intact no matter what. But as she walked through the private hallways of the airline headquarters, knowing she would never step foot here again, she felt something crack inside her. She had lost, and there was no way to undo it. As the officers led her toward a back exit, one that would keep her from being seen by too many employees, her mind raced with panicked thoughts. Would she ever work for another airline again? Would the whispers follow her wherever she went? Would people hear her name and remember this flight, this mistake, this moment that ended her career? She had never once stopped to consider how many other people she had treated unfairly over the years. How many passengers she had dismissed, looked down upon, made feel like they didn't belong. It had been so easy, so effortless. And now she was on the other side of it. She had become the person people whispered about in hallways, the one who was being judged, the one being removed, and she hated every second of it. The officers stopped at a private employee exit, one that led straight to the parking lot. Miss Calloway took a slow, shaky breath. "Am I free to go?" she asked, her voice hoarse. One of the officers nodded. "You're not under arrest, but we do recommend you leave quietly." She nodded stiffly. Without another word, she pushed open the door and stepped outside. The afternoon sun was blinding against her pale skin. the warmth of the day feeling mocking rather than comforting. She blinked hard, adjusting to the light, but she had barely taken 2 steps into the parking lot when she froze, because waiting near the black town car parked by the curb was Mira. Ms. Calloway's stomach twisted sharply. She had assumed Mira would still be inside, finishing her duties, moving on with her day. But no, she was standing right there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Ms. Calloway forced herself to stand taller, to gather the last remnants of dignity she had left. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Mira didn't flinch. "I wanted to see what it looks like when someone like you actually faces consequences." Ms. Calloway's jaw tightened. "I made a mistake," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. Mira shook her head slowly. "You made a choice." The words stung, because they were true. Miss Calloway had always believed herself to be someone who followed rules, who maintained order. She never considered that maybe, just maybe, she had been using those rules as an excuse to justify her own biases. She had thought she was protecting first class. Instead, she had been deciding who was worthy of being there. And now, she was standing outside an airline she would never work for again. Mira studied her for a long moment before sighing. "You know, when I first started working with you, I thought you were the kind of person who never made mistakes. That you always knew what was best." Ms. Calloway's throat felt tight. "And now," Mira exhaled, "now I just feel sorry for you." Ms. Calloway's stomach dropped. She had expected anger, bitterness, even satisfaction. But pity? That was so much worse. Mira didn't wait for a response. She shook her head one last time before turning, heading back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. And just like that, Miss Calloway was alone. She had walked into this day believing she was the one who decided who belonged where. But in the end, she was the one who didn't belong anywhere at all. Miss Calloway stood motionless in the parking lot, the warm breeze barely registering against her skin. The quiet hum of distant airport traffic filled the air, but it was nothing compared to the noise inside her head. It was over. The job she had dedicated more than a decade of her life to, the authority she had worn like armor, the reputation she had built. It was all gone. Not just taken from her, but stripped away in a way she could never recover from. She had told herself for years that she was just following policies, that she was keeping order, maintaining standards. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had never truly believed that everyone deserved to be in first class. And now she was the one who had been denied entry. She swallowed hard and forced her feet to move, making her way across the lot toward her car. Each step felt heavier, like she was carrying the weight of every moment that had led to this. Every passenger she had dismissed, every quiet judgment she had passed, every time she had assumed she knew someone just by looking at them. She reached her car, gripping the door handle with cold fingers. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. No schedule to follow, no authority to uphold. Just emptiness. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled open the door and sank into the driver's seat. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the dashboard, her breathing shallow. She could still see the way Elias Carter had looked at her, the way Leona Carter had spoken with that deadly calm. And worst of all, she could still hear Zaylen's voice. "Now you know what it feels like, to be told you don't belong." A shiver crawled up her spine. She had thought the worst part of this was losing her job, but the real punishment wasn't her termination. It was the fact that, for the first time in her life, she was being forced to see herself the way others had seen her. For years, she had dismissed the discomfort of passengers who felt unwelcome under her authority. She had ignored the uneasy glances, the subtle hesitations, the frustration in the eyes of those she had quietly ruled over. She had never truly believed she was wrong, until now. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as a sharp ache settled in her chest. This wasn't just about one flight. This was who she had been for years. And now the realization came crashing down on her like a tidal wave. If Zaylen hadn't been the son of the airline owner, she wouldn't have been punished at all. She would have walked away thinking she was right. The thought made her stomach turn. Because if she could be wrong about this, if she could be blind to something so obvious, then how many others like her were out there? How many people in positions of power were making decisions just like hers? Every single day? She inhaled sharply, blinking back an unfamiliar sting behind her eyes. Regret. It settled deep in her bones, a foreign and unwelcome presence. She had spent 12 years building her career, her reputation, her authority. But in all those years, she had never stopped to ask herself one simple question. Had she ever truly been fair? She exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. And maybe that was the worst part of all. At the terminal inside the airport, Zaylan sat comfortably in one of the private lounges, swinging his feet slightly as he sipped his juice. The tension from earlier had faded, replaced with a quiet sense of relief. His father sat beside him, glancing at his watch before turning toward his son. "You okay?" Zaylan nodded, adjusting his stuffed airplane in his hands. "Yeah." Leona watched them both, her expression unreadable before she finally spoke. "She looked shaken when she walked out." Elias hummed, adjusting the cuff of his suit. "Good. She needed to be." Leona tilted her head slightly. "Do you think she learned anything?" Elias was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Finally, he exhaled. "That's not up to me." Zaylan glanced up at his father. "Then who's it up to?" Elias met his son's gaze. "Her. Because at the end of the day, no amount of punishment, no termination, no loss of reputation could force someone to change. They had to choose to change." Zaylan processed his father's words before nodding slowly. He wasn't sure if Miss Calloway would ever really understand what had happened today, but he knew one thing for sure. She would never forget it. And sometimes that was the first step. Elias ruffled his son's hair lightly before standing up. "Come on, let's go home." Zaylan smiled, picking up his tablet and his stuffed airplane before sliding off the seat. He reached for his father's hand, gripping it firmly as they walked toward the exit. And just like that, the boy who had once been told he didn't belong walked out of the airport knowing that he did. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.